funny, political scientists are really rarely described as rock stars. I think I can say that definitively. I saw that you put back by popular demand. How many people here, show of hands, actually saw me last year? Wow. So you're saying I need to give a new speech, is what? That's what I'm hearing. Well, thank you. I'm very flattered. I'm delighted to be here. I met a lot of you folks afterwards last year, and I'm looking forward to doing the same this year. Life has changed, there's no question. You will remember at the beginning of last year's presentation, I put up some slides and made you guys vote on stuff. This time, I was in the office the other day, and I thought I would put together some fun facts for you that I thought would be broadly illustrative of some of the themes that I wanted to discuss with you today about where the world is heading. So, number one fun fact. In 1974, 3% of American congressmen retiring went into the private sector as lobbyists upon retirement. Today, that number is 51% for Senate. It's 44% for the House of Representatives. That's a dramatic change. And it's interesting, you can break it down by Democrat and Republican. It actually doesn't really have statistical meaning in terms of the figures. I had heard that Dan Yergin was talking a little bit about the election yesterday, and then this morning, some of you guys asked me, well, you know, what do you think about the elections, and what are the implications, and how is it going to change? I think one thing I want to say that comes from that fact, we're just finishing up the Democratic National Convention down in Charlotte. We had the RNC in Tampa a week ago. And this week, a lot of people were looking at the speech by former President Bill Clinton, and then they looked at the speech by Elizabeth Warren up there in Massachusetts. And they said, which one represents Obama? If he wins the election, are we going to see someone who really tries to reinvigorate a broader national political debate, or are we going to see a tack harder to the left, more populism, more anti-business rhetoric and policy? And what I want to say is that it matters a lot less than one would think. When you talk about the likelihood of a divided Congress, and when you talk about a Congress where private interests play the inordinately powerful role that they do in the United States, as opposed to Canada, as opposed to Europe, as opposed to Japan, other developed states, you realize the needle can move only so much. And so we can talk about the U.S. election, and I can tell you, I think 65% likelihood at this point Obama's probably going to win. We can talk about foreign policy implications. We can get into all of that. But the reality is that you're not going to see a sea change in fiscal policy in the United States, in tax policy in the United States, in corporate policy, irrespective of whether it's Obama or whether it's Romney. That's my view. Second fun fact. New Zealand has more diplomats than India. New Zealand is a country of 4 million people. India is a country of 1.1 billion people. So let me say that again. New Zealand has more diplomats than India. If India is one of the world's rising economies, if India is one of the new most important players globally, let's even assume that India wants to play a more global role. How can they affect that when they have fewer diplomats than New Zealand. They have more sheep than New Zealand. New Zealand has a lot, but they have fewer diplomats. Fun fact number 3. Stick with India for a second. India has 23% of its population, of this 1.1 billion, that have a secondary education. 23%. On the one hand, that is an extraordinary challenge to creating the kind of dynamic economy that is required to sustain long-term growth in a radically changing global economy. There's no question. On the other hand, that is an enormous opportunity for strong, continued, sustainable upside if they can get these kids in proper schools. On balance, long term, I am optimistic, not pessimistic. I think this is an opportunity, not a challenge, and we will see that and we will embrace it. In the short term, India has lots of problems. We can talk about that too. Okay, fun fact number 4 is that in Japan, the Yakuza today, organized crime, mafiosis, all sorts of tattoos on their fingers and such, at lowest numbers in over 20 years. Organized crime, record lows in the last 3 decades in Japan today. This is after Japan has come through the single worst year they have experienced since Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You guys know how much gas costs in Japan compared to the United States. They've got 2 nuclear plants back online. That's it. They had to completely rebuild a very serious piece of their entire supply chain. They had a major city washed away. They've got fantastic problems in domestic governance. They've got functionally 0% growth and have had no growth for 30 years. And yet, we see more civic harmony and more capacity to police and govern their country than we had 10 or 20 years ago when this entire problem began. Developed states are stable. That matters. Structurally, it matters. One of the big themes that I want to share today is how much the world changes when it's being driven by emerging markets as opposed to being driven by the developed world. As you think about your theme for next year, as you think about what you want to address in this conference, and how you want to position your corporations in this global environment, I would say that the coming year is going to be much more about concerns in the emerging markets space. Since 2008, that has not been the case. In 2008, we had this massive financial crisis, and for the last 4 years, in various manifestations, our concerns have been, oh my God, how do we dig ourselves out from this? First, the United States, and will the banking system collapse? And is there going to be a double dip? And how will we create stimulus to respond to it? And then Europe. And is Europe going to fragment? And will we lose the Eurozone? And how will they manage to get themselves through this existential crisis? And in 2013, as we get to the fall, I would like to argue to you that the United States is going to look pretty stable, though they won't be fundamentally addressing a lot of the big structural issues that will remain on the table. And those two things are related. That Europe will actually look to be moving significantly towards a solution. And there is upside and downside attached to that. That it will be more obvious that Japanese resilience matters. But the emerging market space, remember 2008, 2009, the one refrain we all had was, thank God for the emerging markets. Because if it wasn't for the growth coming from China and India and Brazil and Indonesia and Turkey, if it wasn't for all of those markets, boy, the global economy would have been in parlous shape. And we have been saying, thank God for the emerging markets for 4 years consistently now. In a year's time, we will not be saying that. I am not saying this to scare you away from the developing world. But if you want to talk about riding the wave, if you want to talk about capitalizing on change that will have growing velocity, will still have growing velocity, we need to embrace the fact that this emerging market space is going to be facing very big challenges. China growth is slowing, but we are not going to see another round of stimulus, even given the fact that they are in the middle of this extraordinary political transition. India growth is slowing, but the government has been sufficiently discredited that they cannot get stimulus through. Brazil growth is slowing, stimulus is happening and will continue to happen. Russia, capital flight is picking up on a weekly basis. The reform process is dead. There's some engagement on the energy side, bringing in new big deals to get done, but generally speaking, the Russian economy is moving in precisely the wrong direction, and growth will continue to contract. 2013 will not be a world environment where we are glad that emerging markets are leading the charge on growth. We will be more concerned. The flip side is that Europe will not look as bad, and I want to get into that. And the flip side is that the United States will look like even more of a safe haven, despite the fact that unemployment will remain outsized. Who saw the job numbers this morning? Not a happy picture. Unemployment went down to 8.1, but only because people took themselves out of the workforce. If it was the same numbers, it would have shot up to 8.4. Not going to change the electoral outcome insufficiently bad or good, but clearly from a structural position, that's not great news. But even given that, the United States in 2013 will look like a safe haven. QE3, more quantitative easing, that is clearly coming down the pike. In this environment, the U.S. does not get punished for that. The dollar does not get punished for that. Interest rates stay very low in that environment. That's where I think 2013 is heading. The one consistency, big consistency with the speech I gave last year is that we still have an absence of global leadership. Last year I talked a lot about the implications of that. I wanted to very briefly this year talk about why it is that I think it's persisting. And it won't go away in 2013 either. There are 5 quick reasons, only 5. Number 1, too many countries. Too many countries that matter, too many countries sitting around the table. If I sit down with a table of 20 of you and we want to figure out where we want to go to dinner, and I do not act in an arbitrarily dictatorial fashion, as is sometimes my want, we will not be going for dinner because we can't figure that out, right? Numbers are hard. Larger numbers are hard. There are simply more countries that matter, more countries with a voice, more countries that have the ability to say no, and even more problematically, more countries that have the ability to say, I'm not sure, let's talk about it longer. Because at least if a country says no, you can say, okay, us versus them, let's talk about us. But when you have 20, 25, 30 countries that matter, and 15 of them say, let's discuss this. You have these people in your corporations. You don't get this done, okay? That's number 1. Too many. That's not changing anytime soon. Number 2, these new countries, the new ones that have just joined the table, they are different. They're different. Fareed Zakaria, I love Fareed Zakaria. I actually had lunch with him 2 days ago. We always talk about big global issues. One of his big global themes in the post-American world, a book that's worth reading, is the rise of the rest. The emerging markets are the rest. They are a bunch of countries that before hadn't risen, now they are, and now we're all going to be together, and it's a big happy family. There's only one problem. They're not the rest. They're the different. They're not bad. We're not bad. It's different. But different is problematic because we frequently don't like different. We don't get along with different. We don't do different well, right? We go out for Chinese. We don't have it in our house every morning, right? That's a problem for us. That's a problem for us. You think about what I mean by different. The emerging markets are poor countries. The developed states are comparatively rich countries. They have different priorities. They have different political systems, different economic systems. They're focused much more domestically, the emerging markets, and they should be. Just think about the Arctic. The Arctic is melting. It's going away. We won't have Arctic ice cap. As a consequence of that, there's going to be all of these resources to exploit. The American perspective on that is, look, we're contiguous. We've got Alaska, plus we have Canada. They're our buddies, as long as we do Keystone, which we will. And takes some time, but we'll get there. I agree with Dan on that, irrespective of Obama-Romney, that happens. The point is, we're going to focus on that rule of law. We set up, we've got the regimes, we've got the allies, we'll go and exploit it. Chinese perspective is they look at the Arctic and they say, nobody lives there. Nobody lives there. We've got 1.3 billion people. It's about 20% of the world population. Ice goes away. Lots of stuff where nobody lives. We should have 20%. I will tell you, not as an American, but as a political scientist, that's a perfectly reasonable perspective. We won't agree with it. It won't happen. But it will cause a fight. That fight is coming, I assure you. We are already seeing that fight in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. We are seeing that fight with Hillary Clinton in Beijing just 2 days ago. We will see that fight. 2013, we will pay much more attention to conflict between the U.S. and China. That is coming. Romney or Obama, does not matter. But my point is that countries that are poorer and that have different priorities, because they have different levels of development, they have different perspectives, they have different political and economic systems, they will not cooperate and collaborate with us the way that we have seen allies cooperate and collaborate historically. That's just structurally different. Number 3 is that I mentioned the Indians have fewer diplomats than New Zealand. This is not just an India problem. The emerging markets historically have not played a global role. They haven't done it. The corporations in the United States and Japan and Great Britain, they've been international for decades, in some cases centuries. That's not true for the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Turks. They are just learning this stuff. The Americans have done international aid and development for decades. The Chinese haven't. And you see this after earthquakes and tsunamis. They don't have the diplomatic cadres. They don't have the philanthropists. Doesn't make them bad. It just means that the capacity isn't there, even as they want to play a more effective international role. Very interesting in the Middle East. As the United States says they want no part of Syria, as the United States tells the Israelis, we really don't want to engage in military strikes against Iran, and as these conflicts grow, there are many countries in the region that want to play a more effective role. They want to play a bigger role. Qatar, gas giant but tiny population, very rich Qatar, wants to play a dramatically greater political role, and they are sending money to Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, and they're sending money to people they support in Algeria, and they're sending money to the opposition in Syria. But Qatar has no established diplomatic capacity. They've never done this stuff before. so they won't do it effectively. And they just don't have the number of people. They don't have the people that can make the decision making. Everything has to go up to the emir. And so how many things can they do? How effectively can they play a role? Even if they're really smart, even if they're well-intentioned, even if they have the cash, they can't do it. It will take years in the same way it took us years to build out our international capacity for our corporations and for our governance and for our people. It will take these countries decades. But sitting around, we're saying we don't have decades. Okay. Fourth and fifth, the United States doesn't want to do as much, and the Europeans, the Japanese, our allies, even less so, because they're so distracted. We just had a Republican National Convention. We had Romney give his acceptance speech. Obama has expanded a war in Afghanistan that the U.S. is clearly losing, and Romney did not mention that fact in his speech, did not talk about Afghanistan. Why? Because Americans don't want to hear about Afghanistan. They just want out. And everybody gets that. There's no argument. They want it out of Iraq. They don't want into Syria. The Americans do not increasingly want to be the world's policeman the way they have historically. They do not want to be the lender of last resort globally. We see this with conversations with the Europeans. They do not want to lead globalization. Increasingly, very large percentages of Americans feel that way, and you see it in the poll numbers and you see it in the surveys. And you see it reflected in the speeches given by the Republicans and the Democrats at their respective conventions. And if that's true of the United States, that is overwhelmingly true of the Europeans, who are doing nothing but Europe. Every day, all day, for the last 2 years plus, and going forward, because they're busy. And that's true of Japan, too. They're busy. Get through the crisis with Fukushima, now they've got a political crisis. They've had 17 prime ministers now in 23 years. It's about to be 18. Nota's not going to last another 6 to 12 months. Not doing a bad job, doesn't matter, right? You put any one of these factors by itself would have been sufficient to grow the velocity of global change. All 5 of them guarantee it. There is no countervailing factor. I would say for the next 5 years, structurally, that is what we're going to see. Growing global uncertainty, growing volatility, which we can take advantage of. It's not downside, it is very different. It is very different from the globalization order that we've been living in for decades and decades. Now, let me spend a little time before I open a Q&A talking about some of the specific opportunities and crises that we see right now. One of the things I said that probably was more controversial was on Europe. The good news in Europe is that the forces for integration are clearly winning. The bad news for Europe is also that the forces of integration are clearly winning, right? There is downside. And the downside is that we're seeing more austerity. Austerity will last for longer. We are not seeing pro-growth policies anywhere in Europe. And furthermore, there is a backlash. And that backlash is that not only does every incumbent lose in Europe, every incumbent up for election loses because austerity is not popular and growth is not happening, and so you just get rid of these people. And you see it in Spain, and you see it in Portugal, and you see it in Italy, and you see it in Greece, and you see it in France, and how many other places do you need to see it? But not only are you seeing that change, but you're also seeing the rise of radical populist parties. Now, I would be more concerned about that trend if it wasn't for the fact that this rise of radical populist parties in Europe is completely incoherent. It's the Pirate Party getting 8.9% in recent elections, regional elections in Germany and in the Czech Republic, who support freedom of internet and download anything, anytime, anywhere, right? It's Syriza in Greece, which is this proto-communist, throw everybody out, no more democracy, no more Europe. It's the National Front in France, which is on the complete opposite side of the spectrum and is a strongly anti-immigrant, virulent, populist national movement. There are lots of these things in Sweden and the Netherlands and Britain, the Independence Party showing up in Britain. All of these things are popping up. They are all small. There is almost no violence across Europe despite all of the hardship. Even in Greece, where are the demonstrations? And it's because they're comparatively wealthy. Comparatively wealthy. This is not Tunisia. Fruit merchants in Spain are not setting themselves on fire. Right? We're thankful about that because Europe would be in much worse shape if it did not have the economic capacity it does. But the bad news in Europe comes from a relatively high position of stability, and the good news is that the Germans and the ECB and the French and the Dutch and the other core European countries are committed to continued, stronger integration. The challenge you're going to see over the next months is that the ECB understands, the European Central Bank understands, that even if they say they're going to move without moving on buying debt, that creates so much market reaction that it takes all the pressure off of the countries that need to continue with austerity to continue with their policies. So the ECB and the Germans have to continue to play this game of we'll give the money, but only once you sign on to all of these incredibly restrictive policies. And that, in turn, brings the market back down, and it constrains these economies again. They are moving. They are moving in a direction of stronger integration on ECB bailouts and on common bank supervisory structure. It is happening. But it is happening incredibly slowly in a way to maximize economic pain so that difficult decisions politically will ultimately be made. That makes me, I guess, a Euro optimist. Greece may exit, but if Greece exits, it'll only be because everything else in Europe has already been sufficiently coordinated that the Greek exit no longer matters to anyone. In other words, I don't believe that Greece is a meaningful risk for us to be discussing anymore. For the next few months, while there still are these big structural questions about Europe, the Greeks will be given money or they will be given flexibility. And you guys remember, just a few months ago, everyone said the Greek government was going to collapse and it was going to be a disaster. And then, of course, they had a first election and a second election. And now what do you have? You have a technocratic government that's actually aligned with the Germans. They can't implement anything, but they're aligned. So, again, what I want to do is, because the headlines are so doomsday around Europe, and they seem to imply that there is this looming risk the whole thing is going to fall apart, I'm spending some time to try to dispel that for you. That's where I think we are on Europe. Looking to the Middle East, the story is worse. The story is worse in the Middle East in part because as things unravel in many of these countries, the international engagement will not be there. We have now had 18 months of war in Syria. We've had over 20,000 dead. Just in terms of international observers, probably a lot more than that. There's clearly no interest in engaging directly either through no-fly zones or through creating safe havens, humanitarian. There's no boots on the ground desire for anyone. The Turks won't do it, and they're affected much more than the Americans, the US, the Brits, the Europeans, the Saudis. No one is prepared to take that step. As a consequence, the war in Syria is expanding. You see an opposition leader in Lebanon supporting the Syrian opposition get assassinated. You see firing into Turkey. You see streams of hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees. And you see greater conflict between Sunni and Shia across the Middle East. Because Syria, unlike Tunisia, Syria, unlike Egypt, is a country that is fundamentally riven by sectarian lines. It is a Sunni versus Shia conflict. And that is one of the reasons why Assad has such staying power, is because the people around him, the business community, the military, even understanding that they've done some horrifying things and continue to on a daily basis, all know that the alternatives for them are leave the country, because a future regime will not reflect in any way who they are. They'll become the have-nots. That's a problem. And that is expanding. That makes likelihood of growing conflict in the Gulf higher. It makes the prospect of growing Islamism higher. And we see this in countries like Morocco, and Algeria and Tunisia, places where they're getting rid of their colonial languages, for example, and they're going directly to Arabic. And you see the changes in the media. And the governments don't want to go in a radical direction, but they have to throw populist policies to their people, or they'll have massive instability. This bodes very badly for Israel. I mean, you note that the Democrats had removed Jerusalem from their convention platform and only put it back through a very awkward moment, a public plebiscite where clearly half of the delegates said they didn't want it. No one in the U.S. really wants to talk about Israel right now. They want to talk about domestic U.S. economic issues. But in the region, Israel has lost all of their moderate allies. They're losing the Egyptians. They're losing the Jordanians. They're losing the Turks. Who's left for them? Very few. It's going to make a very difficult investment climate in Israel. And yes, greater possibility and likelihood of conflict as a consequence. This environment I've described to you really is problematic across the Middle East. I still think the Saudis are very stable, despite some demonstrations that we've seen in the Shia areas in the past months, despite the fact that King Abdullah has had to leave the country with significant health issues. I think the political succession in Saudi Arabia will be handled relatively well. The structural issue I'm concerned about most for the wealthy, more stable states, particularly Saudi Arabia, is food. You may not know, another fun fact I should have said at the beginning, over 10% of the Saudi budget right now is food. And that's going up. And it's going up because the population is increasing and only 2% of Saudi Arabia's territory is arable. It costs the Saudis $28 to actually grow a tomato. World's most expensive tomato, more expensive than Japan. So what are they doing? They are actually buying land across sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia so that they can import food if food prices continue to go up. Problem is that's going to cause very significant difficulties with these governments on the ground, many of whom themselves need the money, authoritarian states, but their people want the food. Places like Sudan and South Sudan. This is a serious challenge, and it will crunch these governments over the longer period. So one of the things that's changed significantly in the last couple of years is that even the places that have been more stable are now, as we look medium term in the Middle East, starting to become more of a concern. I mentioned China. As I said, China's been slowing in terms of its growth. Now, last year, if you read the FT, you would have seen them saying that if China goes below 8% growth, all bets are off. That they've got to keep 8% growth, because otherwise the whole thing's going to fall apart. Okay, they went through the 8% number. The only change I've seen is that the FT no longer talks about the magic 8% number. I will say that one of the interesting things is that unemployment in China has not shot up. And as a consequence, the Chinese government is staying very, very cautious indeed. But there's no question that the global slowdown has impacted China. And they had this massive stimulus in 2008, 2009, and they put it in, and they built up all this additional infrastructure, and now they aren't prepared to do as much of it. And the bad loans keep expanding. So they're going to face a more difficult environment. And they're going to do it while the Chinese people are much more aware of everything going on in government. We had the Bo Xilai crisis, and all of the Chinese knew about it and contributed to the reaction of the Chinese government. 5 years, 10 years ago, that never would have happened. It's the expansion of the Chinese internet. And all of this does not make the Chinese government susceptible to collapse. It's still very, very stable. Most people support it. There's a lot of nationalism. But it does mean that we are likely to see the Chinese take a harder line on international affairs as they focus solely on their domestic needs. And so their willingness to play ball with the Americans on broader trade issues becomes smaller. Their willingness to play ball on military issues becomes smaller. Their willingness to do whatever is necessary with third parties to get what they need, irrespective of whether that causes international turmoil, goes up. And that's why Dan raised yesterday the problem of the South China Sea. The United States understands that the biggest challenge long-term is going to be China. I consider China the Voldemort of countries, right? It's sort of interesting. When Obama was asked who the world's top geopolitical threat was, he said bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, right, before they got him. When Romney was asked, he said Russia. And that's because no one can say the name China. The good news is they understand the relationship is sufficiently important that they don't want to create trouble. The bad news is that trouble is coming. The bad news is that structurally we are going to see much more tensions in the single most important economic and political relationship in the world. And one challenge the United States will have is the U.S. still does diplomacy the way it did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. They still engage with many of their traditional allies in the same way. Let me give you an example. The Americans have a special relationship with Britain. They have and they will continue to. And it's institutionalized. And you see it between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the State Department. You see it between our treasuries. You see it goes very, very deep. It's been built up with incredible depth and connections, interconnectedness across the entire governments. So it doesn't matter who wins in Britain, who wins in the U.S., that relationship will persist. There's only one problem, which is that Britain is not very relevant anymore. If you want to look at outcomes in Europe, you go to Germany and you build a relationship with Merkel and you work that relationship, and that relationship has not been built effectively. What's very interesting about China, they have very limited bandwidth. They don't have, very sophisticated diplomats. They don't have much time and effort and energy to do international affairs. So when they do Europe, what do? They do one thing. They do Germany. And what do they talk about? Only the issues that are of direct bilateral interest of the Chinese and Germans. And that's it. That will be a challenge for the United States. To reorient in a world where the relative importance of traditional allies in the United States and how they play in the world is changing dramatically, but the U.S. and its approaches are sticky and strong and durable and stable. And that can be a good thing, but it can also be a challenge. And of course, that is also true in terms of the way U.S. policymaking occurs more broadly. I don't see a fiscal cliff in the U.S. Clearly, I think that irrespective of who wins in November, you will see Congress at the last minute come through with some kind of a piecemeal deal that will avert the contraction, the shutting down of all of these new policies and the spiking of taxes across the board. A deal will be made. It will not be made until the last minute. And it will not be a massive fiscal deal. It will not be Simpson Bowles. It will not be a $5 trillion headline number that changes the way we think about American economic sustainability long term. You can say that's bad news. In the context of a world that is becoming more volatile, the United States can continue to get away with this for a long time. And that's good news. Of course, the other good news is while the U.S. is doing that, it's the world's largest economy that's developing all these technological innovations. You guys all know about that in the energy field, but it's also happening in the manufacturing field and robotics, and it's also happening in the healthcare field and biotech, and it's also happening in nanotech, and it's happening all across the fields. And that, of course, matters a lot. If there is something to be negative about in the United States, It's that disenfranchised voters and citizens are increasing in number but not in influence. And policies will not reflect them. And so over the longest term, that will grow polarization in the U.S. political spectrum. You have larger and larger numbers of Americans that are unemployed, underemployed, or employed in an area that has no potential growth for them or their children. The educational system not being improved to bring them in. No one with a policy that's plausible to functionally change that because there aren't special interests that are sufficiently powerful to represent them. And that allows these structural imbalances to grow. That's the bad news. But again, the good news is it comes from such a high level of wealth, stability, and prosperity that we're not going to see the instability. Last year when I was here, someone asked me a question about Occupy. If I didn't bring it up, no one here is going to ask me a question about Occupy because they're not doing anything. That matters. That matters. In Russia, asking questions about the opposition is increasingly interesting indeed. So, takeaways before I go to questions. I've tried to give you around the world. I've not mentioned a lot of places. Let me end with a couple quickies, right? Is North Korea a big risk? I don't know. And neither do any of you. It is completely uncertain. A new leader's come in, and there's no information. It makes one worry about South Korea, but so far, thankfully, things have not gone bump. Don't have that much to say there. I haven't mentioned Africa at all, but I'm fundamentally still very, very bullish on Africa. Believe it or not, year on year, the increase, last 12 months, the increase in consumption, absolute increase in consumption in Africa, 1.1 billion people, higher than the absolute year-on-year increase in consumption in India, 1.1 billion people. That's astonishing. 50% urbanization, Africa cities right now. That's higher than India. Africa is an exciting place to be. It is taking off. The corporates are getting that joke. It's not every single country. Corruption's very bad in some. Infrastructure's god-awful in most. But in many of them, we're going to see large amounts of inbound infrastructure. And if anyone has not yet gotten that, they should be looking at it. I like Brazil. Of all of the major emerging markets, Brazil continues to have extraordinary governance and upside. 40% of the Brazilian GDP is the government. That's a problem. It's inefficient. But Dilma Rousseff is showing herself to be one of the most effective emerging market leaders in the world today. Better than Lula. Who would have thought that? She's not very charismatic, and she doesn't travel all that much. But in terms of domestic Brazilian policy, in terms of working the fiscal environment, providing stimulus when it's needed, cowing her PT party, and making Brazilian Congress work, she's doing a good job. And yes, they've got the World Cup and the Olympics coming up. I like that too. And I like the small places that are commodities driven, even in this environment. I like Canada. I like their ability to hedge. I like the Aussies, because ultimately they're still providing stuff that everyone is going to need. And I think that is a good environment to be in. So hopefully now I've touched most of these places. Again, you give me an hour, I can't do everything. I got to leave something for next year, God willing. But I hope you found this bit interesting and compelling, and I'm looking forward to provocative questions and comments from the floor now. So if I can open it to you, I would be delighted to.